My name is Nayaswami Devarashi, and we're having a satsang here based on Swami Kriyananda's daily readings from Living Wisely, Living Well. The topic this morning is Be Joyfully Non-Attached. In the reading this morning, if you feel impelled to defend a principle, never do so under the influence of anger. Defend your beliefs joyously. Dharmic, which is to say righteous, causes should be defended righteously, and joyous non-attachment is the only way to mount that defense. You could almost write a book on this reading alone, because Swamiji makes a few very important points. They are related, but they go off in different directions. I'm just going to touch on a few of these with this reading this morning. The most important is that when we act, we're not always, and not everyone's always in a situation or position of having to defend themselves or to fight a battle, but in a sense, we're fighting the battle of life at all times. But Swamiji is saying that when we act in a cause, whether it's an outward cause, whether it's politics or business or a personal battle that we're fighting, he says never act from anger. And this is such an important point. One of the reasons, and a very, very important reason, is that any project or cause that we launch into, the consciousness with which we do it is perhaps more important than even the acts that we perform. Because if we act in anger, even if we succeed, that success is tainted with anger, and it will actually echo down the years with that victory that we've won and with that cause in a way. And I'll use a couple of examples that are really significant. India and America are these two largest democracies in the world. It's why I think these two countries and the people have a lot in common. They're both extremely large countries, and they're the two both successful democracies. Even though they have their struggles, it just shows how difficult such a thing is. But interestingly, both of them were founded on righteous principles. Both of them were founded with a higher goal, with a higher ideal in mind, which was freedom, which was righteousness. The comparison ends a little bit there because India's was founded on nonviolence. America's required some of that. But I would say that if you read the lives of the great ones who founded America at a time when democracy was not even in existence at that point, and there was just despots ruling countries and kings and queens and dictators, you'll see that these people were very, very, very high-minded. They did not, this wasn't just a sort of a terrorist revolution where they hated their overlords and they were going to kill them and put themselves in place. It reminds me of a song when I was growing up. It was a rock song, and the song had to do with, essentially with the type of violent revolution which many people in those days long ago were promoting. And it really described the results of a violent revolution, which was meet the new boss, same as the old boss, meaning that one violent dictator overthrowing another, it's the same old story. And Swami Kriyananda often commented over the years about this principle of starting and founding something that you're working on with the right consciousness. And he pointed out that here in the Americas, North and South America, many of the countries in South America have struggled all these years with dictators and revolutions and these things. And Swamiji pointed out that compared to North America, the United States, that many of those countries were founded on the greed for gold, or the revolutions were just basically done out of anger and hate to overthrow a ruler, but to replace the ruler with their own, basically the same boss, replacing the old boss. And so this really demonstrates that the consciousness with which we do something is more important than anything else. That even success done with anger and hate and those kinds of qualities, it really taints the end results over time. And this is why I think that Again, Swamiji pointed this out with America, and it's the same with India, that the consciousness with which you found something great and important really imbues that end product over the years and even over the centuries, I believe. And obviously, the greatest consciousness with which we can found anything, start anything, and fight any cause is with the consciousness of God. And this is what Swamiji is saying in this reading. It's a very interesting quote, one of my favorite quotes, which has so much deep wisdom to it. It was the American president, Abraham Lincoln, who was truly a great soul. He, I think Swamiji and I think Master actually said, Yogananda did, that he was a yogi in past lifetimes, and he came to fight a righteous cause, which was to help free the slaves, among other things. And during the Civil War between the states in the 1860s, one of Lincoln's advisors, it was a minister actually, he said to Lincoln that, "I hope the Lord is on our side." And Lincoln's response showed an extraordinary wisdom and spiritual depth. He said, "I am not at all concerned about that, but it is my constant anxiety and prayer that I and this nation should be on the Lord's side." And what Lincoln was saying was that the most important thing is not to pray that God help us because we're better than the other person and therefore we're right, because I think very often we automatically think we must be right because there's an ego involvement and we're not exactly objective in judging the righteousness of our own causes. And Lincoln was saying, I pray that we are doing the right thing, that our action is righteous, and that we are on the Lord's side. We are with God, rather than trying to win God to our side because we're such good people and this and that, and because, again, out of ego in a sense, which I think very often happens. And so one important part of this that Lincoln was saying, I think, is that not only that our cause is right and is on the side of righteousness and dharma and with God, but that our consciousness be on the Lord's side. And that consciousness is one of joy, it's one of bliss, it's one of attunement to the divine, and it's not one of anger, it's not one of hate, it's one of just righteous, joyful inspiration. And so, more importantly than anything, again, when we fight a battle in our life, whatever the battle is, it can be a personal one just with our own challenges, our own karmas and our own tests. The most important thing, and this is why at Ananda we pray before everything we do. It's almost, I wouldn't say it's humorous, but I think visitors who aren't used to it might be surprised. We do a prayer before every meeting, we do a prayer before our meals, we do a prayer before we go on a trip. We are always starting everything with a prayer. And I think you can understand this in India because whenever you launch a project there's always a ceremony before you start building a school or a temple or something. There's a great ceremony. And this ceremony, again, is not just to propitiate the deities and get God on our side. It's actually more so, and do it with this attitude, it's more to get ourselves in the right consciousness, to do our actions, to launch a project and to start building a particular project with the consciousness of God within us. Because again, when we have the right consciousness, the right attitude, then that energy and that vibration is translated and transmitted into even the very stones and bricks themselves of a building. One time somebody asked Swami Kriyanandaji, what is the goal of Ananda? And his answer was very surprising and almost humorous. He said the goal and the purpose of Ananda is to have fun. And of course everybody laughed and thought that was very humorous. But he was actually very serious. He added, though, that what he really meant was that the goal is to have joy, divine joy. Swamiji very often used this word joy in America when he was talking about the spiritual life. And what he really meant was he couldn't say Sat Chit Anandam every time he was talking to a Western audience about divine bliss. And bliss also has connotations in America, I guess, that maybe he didn't feel people would totally grasp. But joy, people could understand. And anytime he used the word joy, he really did mean divine bliss, Sat Chit Anandam, which is the very bliss of our soul. And so what he meant was that the goal of Ananda, which of course means divine bliss, is to live in God's joy, to live in divine bliss, to meditate, to pray, and more importantly than anything, to develop that inner attitude, that inner connection to the divine, that inner connection to divine joy. And then when we act, our actions should spring from that divine attunement, from that divine joy. And when we act in that way, then success is ensured. And then our successes also, they will be built on a very, very strong foundation, just as I'm thinking of America and India, both founded on this consciousness of higher ideals of freedom and doing it with the right spirit. And then the buildings that we build, any organization that we found, any business that you're working with, if you're a business person, you will find that your actions, when they spring from divine joy and divine attunement, that the blessings of God will flow through you, will touch others, and will even affect, again, even the bricks of the building that's being built. And that's one of the things that's very interesting when people come to Ananda Village. Even people who aren't really accustomed to tuning into vibrations. There are people who walk to Ananda Village, and Ananda Village is a very unique place in America. It's a place where people have been practicing meditation and divine joy for 45 years. And that's very unusual here. It's not that unusual in India, but it's very unusual in America. But people will come here who have no idea what it is they're landing at, and they just feel an extraordinary change in their consciousness. The very land has the vibration of the land itself, from people walking the trails here, chanting the name of God, feeling divine joy, practicing attunement to the Guru. The very land, the vibration of the soil has changed over these years, and you can really feel it. I've lived here at Ananda Village since 1977, and I can say over the years that now when you walk these trails of Ananda, where many, many great souls and saints have walked, chanting to God and feeling divine joy, that you really, really feel it. The land has been blessed and has been made sacred by the consciousness of the people who have walked on it. And in the same way, the actions that you perform, whether it can be in the most worldly sense of outward, in the sense of business, politics, any of these things, when we act with that divine consciousness, then the vibration, the power of the divine flows through us and spreads outward and touches the people especially that we are around, and it also touches the actions that we do and again, even the very buildings that we put together. So anytime you launch on a new project, yes, do the appropriate ceremonies and rituals, but do them with the spirit and the understanding that these things are more to help us change our consciousness and to act when we are working with a project, let's say, from divine attunement and with a sense of divine joy. And then when we act in that way, again, the very stones will be blessed by these things. Now, this reading today also talks about not acting with anger. Now, sometimes we actually have to act with energy and power. And so this is a tricky thing that Swamiji writes here today. Paramahansa Yogananda told a very interesting story. It's a very good story, and it may be a traditional story in India. But what he said was this story was that there was a snake. It was a cobra, and it lived near a village, and it did what cobras do, and it killed people over the years. And so the villagers over the years were trying to kill this cobra, and they were very angry with this cobra, and they were trying to kill it and doing everything they could to stop it. One day a saint wandered through the land, and the saint ran into this cobra, and as saints can do, and this particular saint, it talked to the cobra, and it said, well, why are you killing these people? You don't need to do that. You don't need to eat them. You have plenty of food, and there's a lot you can eat, and please stop doing this. And the saint even taught the cobra the principles of nonviolence. And the cobra must have been a very saintly cobra because it understood, and it tuned into the saint's vibrations, and it understood the lesson. So it stopped harming people. Well, about a year later, the saint was wandering through the same area, and he came across this cobra. again. And this cobra had wounds all over its body, and it was bleeding, and it was nearly at its death. And the saint said, "Oh, what happened to you? What's the problem?" And the cobra said, "Oh, ever since I've been practicing nonviolence to the people of the village, they've been throwing stones at me and trying to kill me and creating all these wounds, and there's nothing that I can do about it." And finally the saint said, "I didn't tell you that you could not hiss at the villagers. I just said you could not eat them." And he said, "Go ahead, threaten them, hiss at them, scare them, just don't kill them." And so this cobra understood that sometimes we must act with the appropriate energy to win a battle. And sometimes it may come across as an expression of anger or threat to someone. If we're in a situation like this, I'm not talking about business relations or most human relations. There's an interesting story, an example of Paramahansa Yogananda in this regard. There was a disciple of his walked into the room, and Yogananda was scolding another disciple over something that this other disciple had done wrong. And as Yogananda was pacing back and forth in the room, scolding this disciple seemingly extremely energetically and seemingly angrily, when Yogananda walked in this one direction towards the disciple who he was scolding, his voice was very strong and his face was expressing a lot of energy and power and strength. And when he turned around and walked in the other direction and saw the other disciple, and the first disciple couldn't see his face was just smiling and divine bliss. And then he would turn around and his expression would change and he would express this very power and strength again. And so it is appropriate to outwardly express in certain situations that we're in. Again, I'm not talking about normal relations, but sometimes it might be appropriate, raising a child or scolding someone who needs a scolding, to outwardly express that quality. But try to do it while still feeling divine joy inside. You will find that when you are acting on the side of God and when God is on our side both, that your actions will spring from an inner truth, and your actions will tend to be much more appropriate in all that you do. And so, again, this is why before any action that you perform, pray, meditate, ask the divine, how should I act? I want to be on your side, Lord, and I want you to act through me. And even in trivial things, this is why at Ananda we pray before meals, we pray before meetings, we start our day with a meditation. We even start the business day at many of our businesses where people will meditate for 5, 10, 15 minutes, just to start the day again in that spirit, in that consciousness of God. Now, there's another interesting thing about this reading today. Swamiji uses the word joyous non-attachment. That's a very interesting way of phrasing it, joyous non-attachment. In the when we read or hear of spiritual teachings, we hear this word non-attachment quite often. And very often the way that it's phrased and the way that we understand it, I think sometimes, that it's almost like an indifference. It's a sort of a neutrality where we're completely neutral about all things. And there's a passivity implied in that type of non-attachment. And what Swamiji is saying here is that true non-attachment should spring from being in such a state of divine bliss and divine joy that we are not affected by what happens to us. Negative, positive, they aren't affecting us because we are in divine joy, not because we're being passive and sort of squelching any response to it that might be positive or negative in an emotional sense, but only because we're in divine joy. And so true non-attachment, in the way that Swamiji describes it, and really in the highest sense, is a very, very positive quality. It's a very, very dynamic quality. It's not at all neutral. It's not at all passive. It's very, very positive and very, very powerful. And so joyous non-attachment means to always, again, try to feel divine joy within us as an energetic, as a very dynamic power of the divine. And then when things happen to us, then you will automatically be less attached to the results. You'll be less attached to whether they affect you positively or negatively. It's also just a nice and a very good affirmation to go through life with this affirmation of being positive and joyful in all circumstances. Essentially, this is what the saints and the masters have won, this great victory of being in divine bliss and not being affected negatively by negative experiences, not getting too caught up emotionally in a positive sense when positive things happen, because they understand that divine joy is so much more powerful than any human emotion can ever be. And that divine joy I'll talk about in a few minutes is won through living a life the way that I've been describing, but also through practicing some of the meditation techniques that were given to us by Paramahansa Yogananda. I'm going to describe and read a couple of sayings from Paramahansa Yogananda, because he described this attitude in life. He often described it as being even-minded and cheerful, is the way that he explained this joyous non-attachment. He said to be even-minded and cheerful in all things, and this is how he described it. He said, "Be even-minded and cheerful. What comes of itself, let it come. Refer every joy and even pleasure back to the joy of the inner self, and let every sorrow remind you that your home is not here in the world of sensory experiences, but in the eternal joy of the soul." Another time he explained it this way: "Life will bring you many ups and downs. If you let your feelings rise and fall with the waves of circumstance, you will never attain that inner calmness which is the foundation of spiritual progress. Be careful, therefore, not to react emotionally. Rise above likes and dislikes. A good rule to live by, and one that will take you sailing through many tests in life, is, under all circumstances, to remain even-minded and cheerful." It's helpful to remember the first reading that I did of these two. Be even-minded and cheerful. What comes of itself, let it come. Swamiji often talked about this as the negative side of this, of reacting emotionally up and down to all things. He described it as the reactive process, which means that we just react in life to everything that happens to us, positively and negatively. And life then becomes a roller coaster ride. And people think that because they feel little spurts of joy going up the astral spine, which I'll get into the science here in a little bit, when something good happens to them, it reminds them of divine joy, but in a way it's like counterfeit joy. But people don't know the difference, and so they think that the way to be happy in life is to have as much pleasure as possible, to have as many good experiences as possible, to keep fanning the flames of the positive emotions as much as they can. But this world is one, as we all know, of duality. And so for every up, there's a down. And every time we experience an emotional high, at some point there has to be its opposite effect of the energy going down and feeling an emotional low. And this is why you see people who are very moody can be very moody both ways, emotionally very giddy and very happy and positive, and then the other extreme, the other end of the spectrum of being very sad and very, very depressed, and again being influenced by outer circumstances and letting those outer circumstances influence them rather than being one with divine joy, which is beyond any influence of duality. This is the science of Kriya Yoga, the way that our gurus have taught it to us. The real reality that we are all facing every day in all the ups and downs of life is not out there in the world, it's in our own self. And the science of this yoga is based very simply on the astral spine. The three main channels, especially of the astral spine, Irda, Pingala, and Sushumna. And our gurus have taught us that as long as we're living in Irda and Pingala, which are two, they're dual, as long as we're living there, we'll be experiencing the ups and the downs of life. When we have an emotional reaction that's positive, some energy goes up the Irda channel and again gives us sort of a glimpse of the deep joy of the soul. But again, it's counterfeit in a sense because it can't maintain itself. It has to be balanced by the opposite of the energy going down the Pingala and feeling an equal amount of sadness and downward pulling energy. The goal of Kriya Yoga especially, and this is why Kriya Yoga is the most advanced and powerful technique on the spiritual path, is because it goes to the very core of our being where our reality is created and made, which is the astral spine. And what the gurus have taught us is that we can get beyond duality, the ups and the downs, the positive and negative emotional reactions, by getting out of Irja and Pingala and going into the Sushumna. Kriya Yoga as a technique, not just as a technique, but as a way of life, because it teaches us how to live life more from the center in Sushumna, rather than in the periphery of the ups and downs of Irja and Pingala. Kriya Yoga teaches us and gives us the ability to go into the Sushumna. And over time, and it's a lifetime of practice, but it's probably the greatest life's work that you can do, is that Kriya as a technique gives us the power and the ability, and I would say the skill, to be able to withdraw our life force into the Sushumna, to direct it up to the spiritual eye, so that we can feel divine joy under all circumstances, divine bliss, and not be affected by the reactive process. And in the end, we stop reacting up and down, positive and negative, just emotionally to the events of life, and we become more in control. This is really true pranayama, control of the life force. This is why Swami Sri Yukteswarji often chanted this chant about pranayam. He said, "Pranayam be thy religion. Pranayam will give thee salvation. Pranayam is the wishing tree. Pranayam is beloved God," is the words of the chant. And Yogananda Ji said, the author of this chant, took poetic license by somewhat exaggerating that pranayam is God. But what he was saying is that the power to do what I've been describing, to withdraw into ourself and into divine joy and divine bliss, comes about through pranayama, being able to control the life force. And then when we practice Kriya Yoga with this understanding, you will find that over the months, over the years, that outer circumstances start to affect you less and less in an emotional way, that you start to become more centered, because then you're able, you have the skill and a sense and the power to be able to withdraw into the deep astral spine. And in the end, finally, it especially gives you the power to be able to meditate deeply, to sit still, to have control over your emotions, over your thoughts, over the restless body, over the desires and attachments. And it gives you, in a sense, the power to be able to give yourself with complete self-offering to the divine and merge back into union with the divine, which is the goal of all of yoga. Kriya Yoga, these principles, these teachings, again, as a way of life, it gives us the power, the inner authority to be able to do that. In the end, the goal of all life is moksha, which is giving ourselves back into the divine. And that only comes about, God is not going to force us and pull us back against our will. We have to make that offering ourselves. And we can't make that offering until we own ourselves. As Yogananda said in one of his affirmations, "Teach me to own again, O own again, my matter souled mind and brain, that I may give them to thee in meditation and ecstasy, in prayer and reverie." Kriya gives us the power to own ourselves, to own our souls, to own our emotions, that we may give them again in complete self-offering back into the divine and go back to our true home. Joy and blessings, and may the blessings of our gurus be with all of us. Om Shanti. Amen.